the patient presents with dysuria, urethritis and leukocyte esterase positivity is there, and there are WBCs, but there are no organisms grown. Clearly urethritis is broadly divided into gonococcal and non-gonococcal urethritis, and the absence of any culturable organisms places it in favor of chlamydial urethritis would be the possible answer. Scrub typhus, how is it transmitted, doctor? It is the larval stage of the trombiculoid mites whose bite is responsible for the transmission of the scrub typhus is what you need to basically recall. Now safe strategy, this is a repeat question in the AIIMS regularly. Trachoma is the very important entity that need to be remembered. Now let us take up this, smash this cell with the product which is being produced. Anyway, all of you know beta cells produce the insulin. There are G cells which are there in the stomach which are responsible for the production of the gastrin, and basically it will be working in conjunction with the gastric chief cells, and the parietal cells is what need to be remembered. What is MMR? MMR is per 1 lakh or 10,000 or 1000 or 100. So precision of facts is what is placed on a test in an exam like this. So mortality ratio of the maternal mortality is number of maternal deaths per 1 lakh live births is called as the MMR. Ischemic bubble disease is one of the important topic from surgical anatomical perspective. What is the part of the GIT which is vascularized by the superior and inferior mesenteric artery we must be doubly sure about. Inferior mesenteric artery will be supplying the large intestine starting from the splenic flexure up to the upper part of the rectum, and proximal to the splenic flexure it is typically the middle colic artery from the superior mesenteric artery. This reason splenic flexure is the point of the line of control LOZ between that of the superior and inferior mesenteric artery is what need to be remembered. Around the central value, how is the dispersion of values? How can we know that in a given normal distribution curve? What statistical measures are available to know the degree of dispersion? Basically there are 4 important variables which are basically called the measures of dispersion: range, interquartile range, the variance and the standard deviation. These 4 are basically called the measures of dispersion. Now 1-2 comments about each of them. Anyway, all of you know what is range. It's a simple term, but we need to know what is the meaning of variance and standard deviation. Basically variance is we'll be calculating the mean value of the whole scores given, and then we will be subtracting the mean value from each of the scores, and basically we will be calculating the variance by using the formula where the value of, every value minus the mean value whole square, and the whole of it is being summated divided by the total number of values will give us basically the value of the variance. Simply you square the variance, then you will get the standard deviation. The square root of the variance is equal to standard deviation, because it is very difficult to interpret the variance because it is much more abstract value, whereas standard deviation gives us some meaning. Within 1 standard deviation how many values follow, within 2 standard deviation how many values fall, etc., etc. Then you have what is called as the interquartile range. Luckily DNB like exams, USMLE, they depend on the percentile scores rather than the rat race of what we have. 1 mark you will get in diploma child health, another 1 mark you get in MD pediatrics. So ideally we have no other way than to pass through the rat race. Percentile score gives a more meaningful value, but how is this percentiles and interquartile range is calculated? 25% of the data will fall less than that of the first quartile. Basically the whole data is being divided into 4 quartiles, and another 25% will fall beyond the 3rd quartile, and that is the reason 50% of values fall between the first and the third quartile, and the discrepancy between the first and third quartile is basically called the interquartile range, and interquartile range is one of the statistical tools to know about the dispersion of the value around the median value. Typically, you can see from this table that the length of the interquartile range here, you have 115 at the third quartile, 105 value is at the first quartile, and the difference between the two is basically the 10 is what is called as the interquartile range. It is also an important indication of the dispersion of the values around the central value, is what I like to once more underscore to all of you. Epidemic dropsy, standard questions, inevitable part of any exam. Alkaloid sanguinarian is the one which is associated, and the BOVA is the one which is seen in the case of the Lathrism is what need to be remembered. Kala Azar is transmitted by, it is by the sandfly, so small questions. Now what is the method to identify the disease in the healthy people and make them unhappy about it? So it is basically called screening. Screening versus surveillance. What is the difference between the two is another favorite question of the examiner. Basically screening differs from the periodic health examination in 2 to 3 things. Screening has got a more wide application, relatively inexpensive, requires a very little physician time. In fact, physician is not even required for gathering the values at all, only for interpretation he is required. But what is the difference between case finding versus that of the screening? Somebody has not come to hospital at all. You have gone to his home and identified flaccid paralysis and diagnosed that he is having typically poliomyelitis, or you have gone to his home and then did a sugar checking and found that he is having diabetes. So it is an example of screening where they have not come at all. A pregnant female has come to hospital for getting a pregnancy evaluation, and in that process you have done VDRL and found the presence of the syphilis, is an example of case finding. So they have come for some other reason and then you have sought it, is basically the case finding. So we are very sure in healthy people you are trying to identify, but here it is not mentioned. Healthy people at the home or healthy people who has come to hospital for some other cause is not clearly mentioned. But anyway, for benefit of doubt, it is the screening would be a possible answer. Now what are the various things which are called the grievous hurt? Getting negative marks in entrance is one of the examples of a grievous hurt which should not ideally happen. Emasculation, permanent privation of the eye or the hearing, and privation of one of the joint, and disfiguration of the head or face like vitrealization, etc., and dislocation of a bone or tooth. They are all the classical examples which have been cited. Cache spaces typically have a role in which important process? The rule of entrance is, if we are not sure about the answer, tuberculosis becomes a correct answer. So also apoptosis becomes a correct answer if you are not sure about it, because such a favorite topic, now the whole world is watching towards the apoptosis. So typically caspases are basically proteases which have a role in inflammation and also in the cell death. And caspases are essential typically for apoptosis for certain important reasons. You have initiator caspases, effector caspases. There is a lot of caspasiology which is a very big subject. Now the point is, caspases are the ones which play the music by initiating a cascade when there is a death, cell death. So you have initiator caspases which contain a specific domain called the card domain, and there is a dead domain called the death effector domain. They are all the parts of the caspases. Finally we need to know that caspases are the ones typically associated with the apoptosis, and in the same light we need to remember one important enzyme called granzyme B. Typically it is the enzyme which is released by the cytotoxic T cells and the NK cells. It is the one which is known to activate the caspases and initiate the apoptotic process, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now what are the signs of the reversible, irreversible cell injury? One of the fundamental questions. Cytoplasmic swelling and vacuolation, mitochondrial and endoplasmic reticulum swelling, and the clumping of the nuclear chromatin, they are all basically the early changes on light microscopy. Whereas the densities in the mitochondrial matrix, cell membrane disruption, pycnosis, karyolysis, karyorrhexis, they are all examples of the late and irreversible changes is what need to be remembered. Now the patient has got hyperparathyroidism and his siblings are having pituitary involvement, thyroid nodules, pancreatic involvement, cutaneous lumpy bumpy neuromas. Then which MEN syndrome does it belong to? Now the confusion is between that of MEN 2A and 2B. Fundamentally, what are the basic differences between MEN 2A and 2B? But before that, MEN 1 are all centrally located, parathyroids, pancreas, pituitary. MEN 2A is medullary thyroid carcinoma, pheo and parathyroid. MEN 2B is medullary once more and pheochromocytoma and neuromas. But what is the fundamental way that we differentiate MEN 2A from that of the 2B is a common challenge to remember. MEN 2A patients do not have the mucosal neuromas and the marfanoid habitus, which is a unique phenotypic expression of the MEN 2B. The MEN 2A patients have a less virulent form of the medullary carcinoma of the thyroid compared to that of the MEN 2B. Both MEN 2A and 2B have medullary thyroid cancer. But relatively in MEN 2A, it behaves like a gentleman. In MEN 2B, it is much more malignant. MEN 2A also have the parathyroid hyperplasia, which is relatively rarer in the case of the MEN 2B, is another important differentiating feature. That's the reason I am not very sure whether mucosal neuromas had been given in the question frame or not. They are given in the exam. If they are there, then the answer would more appropriately the MEN 2A. MEN 2B is what I like to underscore. But I got also some of the students have recollected the question as MEN 1 because he gave only pituitary, parathyroid and pancreatic. So if that is that, then anyway you need to know what is MEN 1, MEN 2A and 2B much more clearly. Now Councilman bodies, typically where do you come across? They are the result of once more a hepatotic death cell of a single liver injury. Earlier they used to think yellow fever, Councilman bodies, they go together. But later on it is being found that even other viral hemorrhagic fevers also, you can see the Councilman bodies, which are the eosinophilic globules typically found. You can see here in the sinusoidal area there is a presence of a cytokeratin, which is cytokeratin negative Councilman body, typically in the case of the yellow fever and viral hepatitis. The first person, case reported by investigator is who? And the first person who got the disease is who? That is primary case versus index case, we must be very sure about. Primary case is the first case which is introduced into the population which is being studied. Whereas the index case is the one which has come to the attention of the investigator. Sometimes investigator may not be a primary case, he may first time diagnose a secondary case also. So an index case can be primary case or secondary case, but primary case is the one which is first infected and brought the infection into the community, whereas first diagnosed would be the index. Then what is Mirena? Once more, invariably contraception is a topic without which there is no question paper at all. So there's a reason Mirena is a levonorgestrel releasing intrauterine system which is containing a T-shaped polyurethane frame T body like this, and typically it will be containing around 52 milligrams of levonorgestrel is the typical Mirena, the contraceptive. 18-month-old child is brought, he has got a history of immunization with only OPV and DPT. I remember answering this question about half a decade back when we were taking the JIPPER entrance also. It's very traditional question. What will you do at 18 months? Baby comes with only OPV and DPT vaccination history. Just we need to understand two principles. Never combine two live vaccines is always the rule. There's a reason, doctor, you can never combine BCG and measles by principle, any point of time. But once more there is an exception for this. So the law says, don't combine two two live vaccines, still OPV and DPT can very much be combined. They stand as an exception. And you are not very sure about BCG and he was not given BCG, then what do you want to give? Do you want to immediately give BCG if there is no history? I still remember in medical college itself, there were half a dozen of my classmates who were not given BCG in their childhood. That means in first year MBBS, they all should receive OPV, right? Not required. So, I mean, they all should receive BCG, not required. Before doing BCG in an unimmunized case, do the MAN2. Generally, MAN2, if it is positive, then there is no need for giving BCG. The rule is, if the MAN2 is negative, then you have to give the BCG. That is the protocol. So, there is a reason, doctor, we can't combine the BCG and measles, so B is out. And give according to the age is not right. Probably we answered D means we are very sure of coming for the next entrance. Then BCG only is not appropriate. In fact, you need to do MAN2 and then do it. So OPV, DPT and hepatitis B would be a reasonable answer over here. Omega-3 fatty acids. Typically, where do you come across? They are a very important polyunsaturated fatty acids which are very abundant in the fish oil. Fish is vegetarian or non-vegetarian, doctor? Depends on whether your mother-in-law comes from West Bengal. So in West Bengal, vegetarians also can take what you call fish perfectly. They consider that it is the God's gift. So that's the reason fish oil is good for health. You can advise your patient who is a non-vegetarian. I can't give up chicken, sir. I love to die tomorrow, but I can't give up chicken. Then what you can say, don't worry, kill less number of chicks, kill more number of fishes. Still you can eat fish is what you can tell. Then he says, thank you, doctor. But next day he comes with severe hypertension. What is the reason? Because he has a special way of eating fish. Dry fish in salt. He eats and hypertension has shot up, and because these are all real clinical scenarios. I used to have a patient from Nellore, coastal part of the Andhra Pradesh. So eat fish happily is what we advised, and he landed up in 190 by 120. So you only told, sir, and I nicely put it in salt, dry fish, and was eating my favorite dish. I was thinking I got this problem, that's the reason I have a chance to eat fish. But you must also tell what is the way your patients cook food. A good physician is not only Science Harrison's internal medicine, he is also a good cook probably at his home for his own wife, and also he must know what is the lifestyle of his patient. Then only you can be able to be a more reasonable doctor. So the most widely available source of the omega fatty acids would be, within fishes also, wild salmon, herring, mackerel, sardines, etc., etc. Whereas the farmed salmon, which is generally grown, it will be grain fed. That's the reason it will have a more amount of omega-6 than that of the salmon. But anyway, fish oil, omega-3, and less chance of hypertriglyceridemia, less chance of acute MI is what need to be remembered. Hypercalcemia. What conditions do you come across? Without a question on hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, dyslipidemias, there is no paper. Our Murphy's law. If you have a hypercalcemic patient before you, doctor, in OPD, he brought the reports. What do you want to do? Two conditions must immediately strike your mind. Primary hyperparathyroidism should be suspected. Number two, malignancy. They are the two most common causes. After ruling out, you should talk about anything else which can cause hypercalcemia. Total parenteral nutrition is one of the important reasons. Vitamin D and vitamin A intoxication. Thiazide diuretics, because in the distal renal tubule they prevent the calcium loss and causes more calcium reabsorption. That's the reason there is a chance of developing hypercalcemia. That is the reason thiazide diuretics, do we use it also for the purpose of nephrocalcinosis patients? Definitely. If more calcium in the urine is responsible for the precipitation of calcium stone, you don't want calcium to enter into urine. So make it to be more reabsorbed into the plasma at the level of the tubules by giving the thiazides. I think another question was also there on the same thiazides and what is their action on calcium. Similarly, lithium is another important drug which causes a mild increase in the serum calcium. Tamoxifen, oral contraceptives, milk alkali syndrome, theophylline among the bronchodilators. Now I like to ask you, What is the other dyselectrolytemia other than hypercalcemia which can be precipitated by theophylline, doctor? Hypokalemia is the one. That's the reason you have a bronchial asthma patient in intensive care unit set up and his potassium is going low, means one of the common culprit would be a bronchodilator which is responsible, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Similarly, vitamin D receptor modulators and oral dietary phosphate deficiency, these are all the important causes, sir. And similarly, malignancies, especially the breast cancer is the most common malignancy which is associated with hypercalcemic state. Paraneoplastic manifestation can be hypercalcemia, especially esophageal, cervical cancer and lymphoproliferative disorders and hepatoma. It can be a paraneoplastic. Endocrinopathies, hyperthyroidism, adrenal insufficiency, pheochromocytoma, they also can lead to development of hypercalcemia. Why hyperthyroidism can cause? Hyperthyroidism is a state of increased metabolic rate, and that will mobilize more calcium off the bones into the serum and lead to the development of hypercalcemic state. Similarly, familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia, tertiary hyperparathyroidism, immobilization, etc., etc. There is a very big list, but at least lithium diuretics for now we need to remember, and theophylline is another important drug. Now SAADH, another common favorite topic which we regularly discuss in our Sunday test, you must be very sure. SAADH leads to hypo or hypernatremia, doctor? Hyponatremia. In which type of patient? Euvolemic individual. That is, patient should not be dehydrated, he should not be edematous. He must have a normal skin turgor. Euvolemic hyponatremia, most important cause is SAADH. Why patient should not be dehydrated? If he is dehydrated, naturally ADH is produced. There is no inappropriate about it. That's the reason dehydration, if it is there, or if he is edematous, what will happen? All the intravascular fluid goes extravascular. And edematous individual is having an intravascular contraction. And intravascular contraction, if it is there, that also stimulates ADH. So that is also appropriate ADH secretion. So a non-edematous individual, non-dehydrated individual who is euvolemic, who is having hyponatremia without four important problems. Without thyroid disease, without adrenal disease, without liver disease, and without congestive heart failure. Without any of them, still hyponatremia is there. Then you talk about SAADH. If SAADH is common in pediatric population, definitely. Meningitis, CNS infections, etc., will predispose to SAADH. Why is it common in adults? Trauma is important cause. CNS trauma can lead to development of SAADH. That's the reason, doctor, hyponatremia and all that antidiuretic hormone prevents diuresis, retains the water and makes the serum to become hypoosmolar. That is the underlying cause. And there is a reason, doctor, normal skin turgor, normal BP should be there, and you should rule out hypothyroidism, cardiac failure, pituitary insufficiency, hepatic disease, adrenal insufficiency, anything which can cause ADH to be elevated, they should not be there. And hyponatremia with a concomitant hypoosmolarity. How do you define osmolarity of the plasma, doctor? Somewhere 290, 295. Once it is less than 280, then you call it as a hypoosmolar state. That also should be there. And there must be a low urine volume is the hallmark of SAADH, is what need to be remembered. Now the question comes, why do you find hypouricemia in the case of SAADH? What is the wrong uric acid has done? Natural thinking is maybe water is retained, no, uric acid concentration fell down because of that. But is it the reason? No. There is one important reason. Typically, when excess ADH is there, antidiuresis is there, water is retained in the plasma and plasma volume expansion is there. This expanded plasma volume will in turn will cause a decreased reabsorption of the uric acid in the distal tubule. So that is also called glomerulotubular feedback. So because of that, uric acid is lost into the urine and there is a hypouricemia developing as a aftermath, as a pathophysiological consequence of expanded volume of the plasma because of the ADH. There is an increased loss and a decreased reabsorption of the uric acid in the distal tubule, leading to hypouricemia is what need to be basically remembered. So there's a reason, doctor, what is your answer for this question? Typically hyponatremia is found, no volume depletion, he is euvolemic, hypouricemia will be there, and there is a hypoosmolality also will be there, is what has to be remembered. A newborn child who is having respiratory distress, on chest X-ray there is a ground glass appearance, he was put on mechanical ventilator and surfactant was also provided, but he is not able to recover. Echo was normal, a very important clue. And then urine cultures are negative. It is a striptease kind of question. If you happen to read pediatrics, you will pick up this question. And a common clinical entity in pediatrics posting. A newborn child with respiratory distress, first thing that will rise in your mind is hyaline membrane disease, which is a respiratory distress syndrome. Second cause is there can be a congenital heart disease which can present with congestive heart failure and respiratory failure with a left ventricular failure with pulmonary edema, can lead to development of respiratory distress. You have to rule out congenital heart disease, you should rule out hyaline membrane disease. Then the third important entity, which is basically called pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, is a very important differential in the pediatric age group, especially if there is a respiratory failure. There is an accumulation of the periodic acid shift positive proteinaceous material within the alveoli, which is causing all that respiratory distress and the ground glass appearance on the plain radiograph. So neonatal respiratory distress with a progressive exertional dyspnea of an insidious onset with a low grade fever and a weight loss. These are the predominant symptomatology of the presentation of the patient. So for the alveolar proteinosis, what are the four differential diagnoses? You should always remember hyaline membrane disease is important differential. Congenital pneumonia, while passing through the mother's birth canal, there can be an infection which can happen, and that can lead to development of pneumonia. Similarly, sepsis is the third important thing, and fourth is congenital heart disease, especially total anomalous pulmonary venous circulation is the one which you have to rule out. So based on the history only can we rule out, doctor? Cultures are negative. That means what is the examiner trying to rule out? Sepsis he is ruling out, congenital pneumonia he is ruling out, then congenital heart disease because 2D echo is normal. So that is the reason it puts the answer in favor of pulmonary alveolar proteinosis would be the highest chance. Another important thing is there any genetic transmission, because there is also a family history. Typically autosomal recessive type of inheritance pattern is being found for congenital alveolar proteinosis. Probably his father's brother's son also had a similar problem. So Henry IV, Henry III, Henry II, all the lineage is suffering from it, is an example of congenital proteinosis, alveolar proteinosis. Then what is this total anomalous pulmonary venous circulation, our favorite topic, regularly we discuss in our Sunday test. Pulmonary veins, instead of draining into the, normally where do they drain? They drain into the left atrium. Instead of draining into left atrium, they drain into the right atrium. So that is a classical problem in total anomalous pulmonary venous circulation. So because of that, what will happen? Right atrium is receiving regular venous return from IVC and SVC, and also receiving from pulmonary veins. So all that load falls on the right ventricle, and right ventricle become hypertrophied, leading to right axis deviation if you happen to take the ECG. So that's the reason, doctor, ECG will help you, and also if you do the echo, then you can see pulmonary artery will show the volume overload, and there is a paradoxic septal motion on the M mode imaging, and typically right ventricle also will show the volume overload state, is what I like to underscore to all of you. So here you can appreciate, doctor, a 2D echo, left atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. Normally left ventricle is expected to be much bigger than that of the right ventricle, but here right ventricle is showing the signs of the volume overload in the 4-chamber view. So that's the reason, doctor, echo being normal rules out the possibility of TAPVC. Blood culture being normal, negative rules out the possibility of congenital pneumonia, and finally genetic history, acute onset of respiratory distress, ventilator dependence, they all place it in favor of alveolar proteinosis is what I like to underscore to all of you. Langerhans cells, CD markers, without CDs, DVDs, there is no entrance at all. Generally leukemia, lymphoma, these topics, CDs, DVDs come, but this time Langerhans cell is the one which examiner's favorite area. CD1, CD45, CD4, CD33 and HLA-DR, they are all considered to be the important cell markers associated on flow cytometry to the Langerhans. Now this is a classical example, immunohistochemistry had been done, and this shows the presence of the staining of the positive CD1A, which is very classical in the case of the Langerhans cell histiocytosis is what you need to basically understand. That's the reason CD1A is an important marker. The child presents with ear infection, which is foul smelling discharge, and on watching the ear there is a small perforation, the pars flaccida. Do you want to operate and do tympanoplasty for this perforation, or do you like to give an antibiotic? Is it topical, is it systemic? A very common situation. Tympanic membrane perforation is the topic of the today's discussion. Typically the repair of the tympanic membrane perforation is generally not indicated, the most important surgical dictum. Only when there are recurrent infections, especially if they are swimmers, etc., or water sport enthusiasts, or if there is any hearing loss which is significant, that is the only reason for repair. Otherwise, tympanic membrane perforations do not deserve. The repair is a very important role. Now the tympanic membrane is having two important areas. There is one tense area and there is a smaller pars flaccida, and the pars flaccida doesn't have a fibrous layer, and it is the one which is associated with a lot of complications, and tympanic membrane perforation is what need to be remembered. Now how do you medically manage in that case? Let us say there is an infection. Topical antibiotic you can instill, and you can also give systemic antibiotic. Generally topical antibiotics are notorious because of their ototoxicity in themselves. That's the reason we tend to give the systemic antibiotic preferable over that of the topical antibiotic, though some give ear friendly topical antibiotics, but the dictum is systemic antibiotics, trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, amoxicillin, etc., directed towards the staphylococcus, pseudomonas. That is the way of management. Now suppose if hearing loss is significant, if he is a swimmer or an aquatic sport enthusiast, then what do you want to do? Tympanoplasty is typically not required if he is non-swimming or minimal hearing loss is there and there are no recurrent ear infections, and typically you have got two ways of doing the repair of that small hole in the pars flaccida. One is you can cauterize those edges of the TMP with a caustic like a trichloroacetic acid is one way of handling. Second is a fat plug tympanoplasty is another important method by which you can be able to do. The next is tympanoplasty, where you will be typically be using general anesthesia or local anesthesia in doing the full-fledged transplantation. Now let us go to the next question. Benzodiazepines versus that of the hypnotics, between sedative and hypnotic, which is sleep promoting, doctor? Hypnotic is sleep promoting, sedative is anxiolytic, as all of you know very well. Now if you give barbiturate like hypnotic, if there is an overdose, there is a very little therapeutic window and patient can succumb to the toxicity, whereas benzodiazepines offer the comfort where they have got a wider therapeutic range compared to that of the barbiturates. Now do they have active metabolites? All do not have active metabolites. For example, if you take lorazepam, it has no active metabolites. That's the reason it can be safely given in a patient who is already having the liver dysfunction like scenario, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now how about the overdose? If there is a benzodiazepine overdose, it can be better tolerated compared to that of the hypnotics is what I like to underscore. And coming to induction of hepatic enzymes, both barbiturates and benzodiazepines, both of them are capable of inducing the hepatic enzymes. Which part of the nephron bicarbonate is reabsorbed, chloride is reabsorbed, H plus ion reabsorbed, ammonia reabsorbed. So nephron physiology, doctor, you can't get away. You have to master the topic, because one question invariably comes, and it is not an enigmatic question. It's one example of a topic which is a winning topic basically. So bicarbonate, generally around 4,500 millimoles of the bicarbonate become filtered every day, because around 180 liters of plasma with a concentration of 25 millimoles of bicarbonate is excreted. Most of this bicarbonate entering the glomerular filtrate is once more reabsorbed by the proximal tubule, because what is called workhorse of the nephron, doctor, proximal tubule, because it has a lot of ATP, nice brush border, majority of the bicarbonate is reabsorbed by it. But how will it do it? Is there any exchanger which will be doing this? Definitely. There is a proton K plus ATPase, which is in the proximal tubule there is a Na plus H plus antiporter, which is the one which is responsible for the bicarbonate reabsorption, is what need to be basically be remembered. What this sodium H plus antiporter will be doing is, it will be secreting the H plus ion into the tubular lumen, and that will be a driving force for the bicarbonate reabsorption to occur. So we require Na plus H plus antiporter, which is very important in the proximal tubule. Now coming to the distal renal tubule, what is important? It is also reabsorbed in the second important area, that is towards in the collecting duct also. But there is one sodium potassium pump, which is the one which is a driving force for the bicarbonate reabsorption to happen. Especially the thick ascending limb of loop of Henle, that is an important area for the bicarbonate reabsorption. And it also has got a similar kind of mechanism just like the proximal tubule. But the third site is the distal tubule, that is the intercalated cells of the collecting ducts, and there it is the proton K plus ATPase which is important, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now if there is a acidosis, what will happen? Do we want more bicarbonate reabsorption, or we want to lose it? We want bicarbonate reabsorption. Who will know that? Will proximal tubule will reabsorb more, or is it the collecting duct reabsorb more, or is it the thick ascending limb of loop of Henle? Who will be reabsorbing more? Who will be responding to the call of the acidosis? Let us say emergency is declared. Acidosis is there. So acidosis typically stimulates this proton K plus ATPase, which is located in the intercalated cells in the collecting duct. So that favors the H plus secretion and reabsorption of the bicarbonate, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Similarly, even aldosterone, what is its action? Sodium retention, potassium loss, and the H plus loss. So there's a reason, doctor, aldosterone also stimulates the proton potassium ATPase in the intercalated cells, and that also will cause bicarbonate reabsorption to happen more. So that is the reason, if there is a more aldosterone, what will happen? For example, we are dehydrated, volume contraction is there, secondary hyperaldosteronism if it is there, then what will happen? It will cause this proton K plus to become activated, it will cause K plus secretion, H plus secretion, and bicarbonate retention. And because of that, there is a metabolic alkalosis which will be there, which is called the saline responsive alkalosis of the volume contraction because of the secondary hyperaldosteronism. So if you once more give saline, if you once more bring back the intravascular volume, if the aldosterone once more normalizes, this drive on the proton potassium ATPase will be lost, and the bicarbonate reabsorption will be stopped, and metabolic alkalosis will also submit. So that is how we need to basically remember.